Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the Speed Chess Championship being held on chess.com. Now, some of you may or may not know, I've actually won the Speed Chess Championship the last 5 years running, and this year I'm going for number 6 in a row. Now, it's very simple. It's a 16-player format. You play matches individually, which have 3 time controls: 5+1, 3+1, and 1+1. And if the match is tied, you go to overtime and then potentially Armageddon. So in my first match, I won against Yu Yangi from China, and in the quarterfinals, I'm paired against Fabiano Caruana from the United States of America. So let's jump into the action. Now, this match was a very, very long match, so we're only picking a couple of games specifically to look at. This first game was the third game played in the 5+1 portion. Now, in the first game, Fabiano beat me. In the second game, I won, and here we are in the third game. Now, in this game, I start with a very famous 1H3 move. Now, this opening is known as the Clemens opening, C-L-E-M-E-N-Z, not to be confused with Samuel Clemens, also known as Mark Twain, who I think also did play chess a little bit. So I play H3 on move 1. Now, in the Speed Chess Championship last year against David Pravian, I also essayed this first move. So Fabiano plays the E5, and now I play C4. Additionally, on top of wanting to just play something fresh with different kind of positions, it should be noted that Fabiano is considered to be one of the greatest theoreticians of all time. His opening preparation is simply bulletproof. So for that reason, you want to get him outside of his comfort zone. He does not have the aid of the computer from the get-go, and perhaps I can try to outplay him over the board where we simply play pure chess. So I go c4, we get knight f6, I play knight c3, and now we're essentially playing a classic English opening, except that I've played this move h3, which does not really do a whole lot per se. So Fabiano plays bishop b4, and now I play the move g4 here, being very aggressive. One argument in favor of playing h3 is if black were to play d5, potentially I can trade and play something like knight f3, knight c6, and maybe e4, because after say a move like knight b6 in this position, maybe I already have bishop b5, and without this bishop g4 move, I'm getting a lot of play in the center of the board very, very quickly. So I can already argue that h3 makes sense. So Fabiano plays bishop b4 here. I play g4 here, trying to be aggressive, maybe kick the knight out of town with g5, so black can't simply play d5. Fabiano castles. I go bishop g2. He plays this move c6 here, trying to play d5 and build a big black center. So here I play queen b3, attacking the bishop on b4, and now Fabiano plays this move knight a6, and I play the move a3 here, asking Fabiano a big question of what he wants to do with his bishop. So here Fabiano trades the bishop for the knight, and I think one thing that I haven't stated so far yet in this video at least is that when your opponent is playing a lot of these offbeat openings, things that are supposed to be quote-unquote dubious, if not just outright bad, where you get a big advantage, you feel this need to punish your opponent. And I do think that here bishop e7 would have been a better move for Fabiano, but after d3, knight c5, and let's say queen c2 here, Fabiano has played something like knight e6 with ideas like knight d4 and maybe d5 later on, but after knight f3, it doesn't feel like there's simply a way to be much better. Now, black is better here, but you don't see the idea. You really want to play aggressively and try to punish your opponent, which is why I think Fabiano decided to trade on c3 and play this move rook e8 with the idea of playing d5. So here I go knight f3, and now Fabiano, after a bit of a think, plays this move d5. Now, this is a move that actually kind of scared me on first glance, because initially, while I was thinking here before playing knight e5, I thought that after d4, and let's say queen g3, for example, there might be some queen e7 idea threatening checkmate if I were to move the knight. But after f4, knight to d7, for example here, I can simply castle, and after takes, in this position, I can play this move e3 here. And white is actually a little bit better, because if black goes d3, I have b4, and I can activate the bishop via this long diagonal, and both of the bishops are going to be really, really strong down the road, and you have a weak pawn on d3. So here Fabiano played knight e4. Now I have to confess that during the game when I spent my time before playing knight takes e5 30 seconds, I actually only was considering d4 or queen e7, and knight e4 came as a very unpleasant surprise. Now this is a very scary move to face here, because I really only have one option, which is to trade the bishop for the knight. If I were to play queen d4 here, trying to guard the knight, black has c5 here, attacking the queen, and after queen takes, and rook takes e5, black simply has an extra horse on the board. So I end up taking, Fabiano takes, and now I have to play this move c5, because if I don't play c5, pretty much any other move, let's just say b4 for example, black can play f6 here, and the knight on e5 is simply trapped. I have no squares available here, and I'll lose the horse. So I go c5, creating the escape square on c4. Fabiano plays queen d5. Apparently f6, knight c4, knight takes c5 is better. Again, this is a blitz game, not something you expect. So we get queen d5, the logical move to attack the knight. Now if I were to play d4, I actually lose on the spot to the classic end peasant maneuver with e takes d3, because now the knight is under attack, there's pressure towards e2, and my rook on h1 is also hanging, and it's just totally hopeless. So I play knight c4, Fabiano plays knight c5, I go knight e3, queen d6, and now I play this move b4. Now this is a mistake. What I should have played here was this move b3 to activate the bishop, create the double A battery and threats of checkmate on g7. And already here the computer thinks after queen e5, rook b1, and the queen trade, black is only slightly better. Instead I play b4, which is a mistake, because now after knight to a4, queen c2, and b5, now I don't get to line up the battery on this long diagonal, and if I ever go bishop b2, black can potentially trade the knight for the bishop. So I go bishop b2 anyway. At this point it's already very tough to play because I can't really castle my king here. If I go to the king side, there are ideas like h5, maybe queen g6, and there are all these threats towards my naked king on g1. And so I play bishop b2, hopefully intending to maybe castle my king to the queen side as well. Fabiano goes a5, I trade some pawns, and now I play this move rook to g1, and here Fabiano plays this move c5. Now rook g1 was sort of a semi-bluff, as we like to say in the game of poker, where I was sort of baiting Fabiano to some degree, because the big question mark is, can black go queen h2? Now if black plays queen h2, I play rook g3 here, guarding the pawn on h3, and after queen h1 and knight f1, it really looks very scary here, because let's just say you go, let's just say rook a6 castles, for example. Suddenly it feels like your queen on h1 is getting trapped here. In reality, it's not getting trapped, because after say c5, I play knight e3, you just go queen h2, rook g2, and the queen escapes. But again, if you don't spend a lot of time calculating the whole line, it's a difficult decision to make, and Fabiano does not play queen h2. Instead he plays c5, and now after rook g3, I was already starting to feel somewhat optimistic about my position for a couple of reasons. First of all, the rook on g3 very active. It can maybe swing over towards the center of the board down the road. Additionally, I can now walk the king to g1 manually and castle my king. So we get a position like this. Now h5, for example, not a threat, because suddenly there are all these tricks towards the pawn on g7. f5, same thing, I just take. And so the rook on g3 here with these pawns is actually a very, very solid defensive setup. So Fabiano decides to play c4 here. I go bishop c3. He plays rook a7. He does not trade the knight for the bishop, because after it takes and rook a6, again I can probably slowly start to walk my king over towards g1. And even though black is better here, this knight on e3 is very nice. It always spies the pawn on c4. There are ideas like knight f5 down the road, something like rook a7, knight f5, and potentially I can even start attacking on the king side with the classic right triangle. So after bishop c3, Fabiano plays the move rook to a7. I go rook to b1 here. He plays bishop d7, which is a fairly serious mistake. In this position, Fabiano needed to either play knight takes c3 here, or play this move queen to c6, guarding the pawn, because after bishop d7, now I can play knight to f5, forking the queen and the pawn at the same time. When Fabiano trades on f5, now suddenly the rook on b1 is always targeting the pawn on b5, whereas in the previous position, for example, if you go back here just to illustrate it, say we get some position like this. Actually this isn't the right order. Let's say bishop c3, rook a7, knight f5, takes, and f6. Here black is still better because the pawn on b5 is not under attack yet. So when I go rook b1 and Fabiano plays bishop d7, essentially we reach this position where he has to defend the threats towards the pawn on g7, all the while hanging the pawn on b5, and here Fabiano plays knight takes bishop. Now again, this is played on chess.com, and our cameras are shared in the Zoom program, so you can see your opponent's reactions. And Fabiano's reaction was very visible. As soon as I played knight to f5, he started shaking his head just a little bit. It wasn't like he thought he was losing, but it was that head shake like, oh, I've done something wrong. So already here I was feeling very confident. So Fabiano trades on c3. He goes g6. Of course, he's got to stop the classic checkmate threat with queen takes g7, and now I play the move rook takes b5, and now the dust has somewhat settled. I'm up a pawn here. My king is very, very safe on e1, and it just feels like a great position. So Fabiano goes rook a8. I take on g6, and now he plays this move h6, allowing this nasty trick with rook g to h, or not rook g, sorry, rook, it's actually just rook to h5. There's no double rooks, but I'm able to play rook h5 here, and now the big threat is queen h8 checkmate. You cannot capture the rook due to the pin. So all of a sudden, out of thin air, I have a raging attack on the king side, and it's very, very hard for black to play. So Fabiano goes king f8. Also, to point out one other thing, if Fabi were to capture the f-pawn to stop the rook h5 trick, I can then take the pawn on c4 with check. So we get h takes g6, rook h5. Fabi plays king f8, trying to run with the king to the center of the board. I check, king e7, we swap the rooks, and now I take on c4, and just like that, voila, I have 2 extra pawns. I have 5 pawns on the board to Fabiano's 3, and technically speaking, this should be winning. So Fabiano plays queen e5 here, trying to create one of the weird, unusual ice skaters with queen to a1, because after queen c1, queen takes c1, this is a classic ice skater checkmate, except the king is stuck in the middle of the board. So I play king to f1, sliding the king over to safety on g2. We get rook d8. I play the move rook to g4 here, and now Fabiano plays rook d4. I go queen c2, keeping an eye on this pawn on e4. Fabiano plays queen d5, and now I have this very nice move, pawn to e3. Now the reason I play e3 here is that I have to do something. While I have 2 extra pawns, they're not the greatest extra pawns in the world. First of all these pawns on the second rank are a little bit brittle here. It's very hard to get this a pawn rolling up the board, so I really need to get rid of this pawn on e4. So I go e3. Fabiano plays rook c4. I go queen b1, covering the d3 check, all the while spying the pawn and potentially infiltrating with the queen on the b file. We get king to f8. I go king g2 here, and now Fabiano plays queen f5, and I go rook to f4, queen g5, and I go king to h2. Now what I'm trying to do is just strengthen this rook on f4 where it's supported by all these pawns, spy the pawn on e4, and then eventually bring my queen down the board. So Fabiano plays queen d5 here. If he were to play queen e5, stopping queen b8 with the idea of playing g5 to win the rook due to the pin, I could quite simply play the move queen to b7 here, attacking both the pawn on f7 and the pawn on e4 at the same time. And after black plays a move like f5, I can just play queen to a6, attacking the rook and the pawn at the same time, and this is simply hopeless. So he goes queen d5, guarding all the pawns and stopping queen to b7. I play queen to b2. Fabiano plays king e8, and now I play check, king e7, and I play this move h4 here. A very quiet move to basically stop g5 from being played, but also keeping the queen f6 move still in play. So if black were to capture after queen f6 check, king moves, queen f7, I win the rook, and with it I win the game. So we get rook to c2. I play queen f6, king to e8, and now I play this nice move, queen to g5, offering the trade of the queens. And here Fabiano trades the queens. Now again, keep in mind I have 2 extra pawns. If for example we get some position like what's an example, something like, let's just say how do I set it up, something like this for example, I only have 1 extra pawn and this should be a draw with perfect play. But in this position, because in this position I have 5 pawns versus 3 and I'm up 2 pawns, as long as I can maintain the 2 pawn advantage as we transition into the end game, I will win. So Fabi plays queen g3. Now he probably needed to try something like queen e6, just desperately hoping to keep the game alive, but after queen b5 check, king f8, and queen b4, again I'm going to win the pawn on e4, and this end game should be very straightforward with 2 extra pawns. So Fabi takes, and now I play pawn takes queen, not rook takes pawn check first, because after queen to e7 I have to take the queen, and spaghetti-o, I'm simply down a rook. So I play pawn takes queen, Fabi captures, I take on e4, and here he plays king d7, which loses on the spot. He had to go king f8, but after king g3, rook a2, and a4, this is a very easy win, simply because the rook guards the pawn on a4 and cuts the king off here from coming back to the center of the board. One sample line is say rook b2, f3, rook a2, king f4, rook b2. Now I can go king e5, rook a2, king d6, let's just say rook a1, king c6, rook a2, king b5, and then eventually I just start pushing the pawn up the board. Eventually I can build a bridge here, and this will be a very, very easy win with the king and the rook and the pawn just marching down the board. So Fabi plays king d7, and now after rook to d4 check, forcing a trade of the rooks, Fabiano resigns the game here because after rook takes rook, pawn takes, let's just say king e6, a4, king d5, I can now play a5. You can't take because then the pawn gets down the board and becomes a queen. And if black tries to play a move like king c6, I can go king g3, king b5, king f4, sack the pawn on a5, but my king gets in here, and it's just very, very basic. Eventually I simply win this game because I get a queen, and there's nothing more to it. So I win this 3rd game of the match, and I take a very, very big 2-1 lead here, sort of a big swift in the big swing, I guess you could say, in the match, because I was down 1-0 after the first game, but this is the 2nd game in a row which I win. So I take a 2-1 lead, and now we're going to move to the next game. Now I'm not sure what the exact score in the match was at this point. I think I was still up, maybe it was like 5.5, 3.5. I did win the 5+1 portion by a score of 4.5 to 3.5, so I was up by 1 game as we move to the next portion. So in this game I start with the classic Amar opening, that is AMAR. So the move is 1 knight to h3. Now I believe that knight h3 was played by the Czech GM Jurgis Pechak, if I have his name correctly. I did a video sometime back on a couple of his games from a tournament, I believe in Sweden if I'm not mistaken. Very enterprising openings he was playing, and so I thought I would try it out too. Now it has to be said, playing something like knight h3 against Fabiano Caruana, one of the greatest players of all time, is probably not to be recommended by figure due to the 3 minutes plus 1 second increment. If I could just survive the openings, get out of it, make it complicated enough, I figured why not? Anything should be playable. So we play knight h3, I get d5, and now I play the move g3. Fabiano goes e5, bishop g2, knight c6, and now I play d3. Now Fabiano, very standard start, builds the big black center with d5, e5, and knight c6. But now after d3, he plays h5. Now, this move, I believe, is completely fine in general terms. When your opponent starts playing moves like h5, h4, trying to punish you for putting the knight on the rim right away, you know they're very slightly on tilt because this like lashing out, you're trying to punish the opponent. You know what they're doing isn't right. When you try to punish them right away versus playing the absolute best moves, generally, it's a sign that you're tilting a little bit. So after h5, I play this move f3, Fabiano plays h4, and now I go g4 here, basically trying essentially to avoid the h file from opening up. So I play g4, Fabiano goes d4 here. Now in an earlier game, I believe Fabiano played something like bishop c5 and e3, if I'm not mistaken. Now this position is also quite terrible, but I think Fabiano assumed that d4 is simply winning because there's Swiss cheese. I've got all these dark square weaknesses on my king side, and it's very hard to play. So after d4, I play this move c4 here, creating the classic flying V formation with the 2 forwards, 2 defensemen, or with the 2 forwards, a forward, and then the 2 defensemen behind. Anybody who's not watched the Mighty Ducks hockey series from Disney, you might want to check it out. So I go c4, Fabiano plays knight ge7, I play e4 here, and now Fabiano takes a pawn on e3. Now this is a very, very ugly position. I'm literally pushing all these pawns forward. It looks like some kind of beginner game. I'm not gonna lie, it's not pretty, but here Fabiano decides to take on e3. Now this is a move that I would expect someone to play if they're just moving instantly, but in fact it's not the best move. What black should play is knight g6, because if I play f4 trying to open up the king side after takes, knight takes f4, black can go bishop b4 check, king f1, and after queen f6, queen f3, knight e5, and suddenly everything here is collapsing, and I'm going to lose the game very, very soon. So after knight g6, if I can't play f4 and I have to castle, now after black plays bishop d6, again, it's going to be very hard if I can't play f4 in this position to do anything. So let's say I go f4, we get takes. Black can now go h3 here, attacking the bishop. If I take with the knight, suddenly after queen to h4, everything is coming on the king side here. I'm in all kinds of trouble, and I should lose very soon. So I can't really do that. If I go bishop h1, for example, black can play knight c to e5 here, and this pawn on g4 is a super weakness. Black has moves like queen g5, queen h4, rook h4 even, and it's just a total disaster for white here, and white is completely lost. But Fabiano decides to take on e3, and I think the reasoning behind Fabiano playing d takes e3 here is that he was just trying to move quickly and not get too far down on the clock. So I play bishop e3, now he goes knight g6, I castle, he plays bishop to d6, and I go knight d2, he castles, and I go knight e4. Now one big difference here is that Fabiano has castled to the king side. He's also pushed the h pawn, but furthermore I now have pawn breaks with both d4 and f4 looming, as well as a great knight on e4 which can't easily be kicked away. Black could play f5, but after takes and bishop f5, I can now play f4, opening up this diagonal. I've got this diagonal, knights are jumping a little bit, and it's actually not all that bad. Computer thinks that white is actually only marginally worse here. So Fabiano instead plays bishop e7, and now I play f4, trying to open up the diagonal, getting rid of a weakness as well, because this bishop behind this pawn is really, really bad. So I'm trying to get rid of a weakness with f4. Additionally, I want to play d4 and build a big white center down the road. So Fabiano takes, I take back, and now he plays this move knight c to e5, which is a big mistake. What Fabiano should have played here was probably knight takes knight, and after bishop takes knight, he can play something like bishop e6 with ideas like queen d7 and rook d8 to put a lot of pressure on the pawn on d3 and also the pawn on g4. But again, at this point, Fabiano is trying to move quickly. He's a little bit tilted, not feeling so great about himself, and he's trying to punish me on the spot. But knight e5 is simply a bad move, because now after I trade the knights, he takes with the pawn here, thinking that I will end up losing one of these pawns on either c4, d3, or g4. Now, if Fabiano were to capture the knight on g6 and not ruin his pawn structure, I can go d4, and white is actually quite a bit better here. I've got some nice pawns in the center, I've got open diagonals, and black has some weaknesses. I also have an open f file as well. I'm not saying it's winning or anything, but white is much better. So Fabiano sticks to the plan by taking, but after rook takes rook, bishop takes, now I have this very nice knight retreat with knight to f2, which guards everything. It guards the pawns on g4 and d3, and now black has this horrible pawn structure on the king side, and white should be much better. So Fabi goes c6, now I play b3 here, guarding the pawn on c4 so that I can thrust with d4. If I go d4 right away, I hang a pawn. So I go b3, Fabiano plays g5, and now I go d4, kicking the knight out of town. He goes knight g6, and now I play another nice move, d5, further expanding and trying to open up space for my bishops. Now, the reason I played d5 was basically I figured if black takes, suddenly I get this awesome wooden shield in the middle of the board. This bishop is really active here on d5. And if we look at this position right now, the bishop, it's active, but it's not great. And also the bishop on e3 only targets this pawn on g5. So by going d5, I want to open up this diagonal, but then also I want to activate the dark square bishop as well on the other diagonal. And I also have a connect 4, which means I'm going to win. So Fabi goes c5, trying to close down the diagonal, and now I play this move queen to c2, attacking the knight on g6. Now the computer is very brutal and it actually wants this move d6, but after queen d6 I didn't see a forced win. And generally when you're playing in these blitz games, if you don't see a forced win but you know you have an advantage, you try to build upon it rather than going for something like d6, because I am temporarily sacking a pawn. So I don't have a win and I'm not able to figure it out. Suddenly I've sacked a pawn and I'm losing all the momentum, and suddenly I might not win the game anymore. So I play queen c2, attacking the knight. Fabi plays knight to f4. I trade the bishop, and now I go queen g6. Idea very simple here. Black is lacking activity. The bishop on c8, very passive. Rook on a8 is not in the game. Additionally, I want to go rook e1 and rook e8, or even bishop e4 and queen h7, creating the classic double A battery, and there should be some checkmates. Now, computer actually already here thinks this is very close to loss simply for this reason. If you go bishop d7, actually computer wants d6 here even more than bishop e4, but I saw bishop e4, and even this looks absolutely miserable with the queen h7 threat, which is unstoppable. So Fabi plays queen f6, which is a very practical move here to force the queens off the board. But unfortunately in this position, even though he has the bishop pair, he has a lot of problems because his bishop is basically walled. It has no activity even on d6. Very limited activity until down the road. So I go bishop e4, he goes bishop d7, trying to bring the rook in. I go king g2, rook e8, king f3, bishop d6, guarding the pawn on f4, and now I play rook to e1, and here Fabi plays king g7. Now the last chance for Fabiano to maybe save this game would have been b5 here, and the reason is that if I play a move like rook e2 after takes, and rook b8, suddenly you have an active rook on the b file, potentially. Instead, Fabi goes king g7, I play this move h3, and now he plays a6, and I go rook e2, and he plays b5. But now, as they say in the classic JoJo song, it's just too little too late. And the reason that it's just too little too late is after b5 I have this move bishop to f5, because now the rook on e2 is guarded by the king, and black can't really dodge a trade. If you take the bishop, you hang the rook on e8, so that would lose. If you play rook to d8, trying to keep pieces on the board after takes, and I think rook e6 here, white is just dominating the entire board here with this great rook on e6, this knight on e4, it hits everything, and you have a weak pawn on f4 as well. So if you go bishop e5, I can take on c5, I can even play g5 to undermine the bishop here, and it's just absolutely hopeless. So Fabiano trades the rooks and goes bishop e8, trying to survive. If he were to trade the bishops, this is also completely lost, because after takes, and say king f7, I have knight e4 here, king e7, king to f3, and now we're in a classic Zugzwang. If black moves the king to f7, you hang the bishop. If you move the king to d7, you hang the pawn. And after a5, a4, which is the last set of moves, black has no good moves. If you move the king, as I illustrated, you lose this one, you go this one, you lose that one. And if you move the bishop, I take the pawn, come back, and now with these two connected passed pawns, it's just over. I can even potentially just grab this pawn on the edge, and then we end up in a situation with the classic wide peepos here, and there's just nothing black can do. So Fabi plays bishop e8, I go knight to e4, he plays bishop f8, and now I go d6. Now king f3 is also probably winning here, but I felt like if I go d6 d7, it has to be winning. And why do I want to play a move like king f3, which maybe after king f3 you can trade, maybe go bishop a4, some kind of infiltration with the light square bishop. Obviously, as you can tell from the valuation bar, this is completely lost, but you don't want to give your opponent counterplay if you don't have to. So I decided to play d6. Fabi plays bishop c6, I play the move d7, bishop e7, and now I take on c5 here. Black cannot capture the knight, because after bishop takes knight, I make a queen and win the game. So we get king f7, and now I play this move bishop e6 check, king g6, and now I play this very nasty move bishop d5, and Fabiano unfortunately has to resign here because there's no square for the light square bishop. Again, if you take the knight, I get a queen, and you can't take the pawn because you lose the bishop, so you have no squares for the bishop to go to. So the only thing you can do is trade the bishops, but after takes, and let's just say king f7, there are many ways to win, but probably the cleanest is d6, bishop to d8, and then knight to b7, attacking the bishop. You have to move the bishop. I make a queen. You give up the bishop, but at the end of the day, with a knight on the board in this endgame, I simply mop up all the pieces, or mop up all the pawns, I should say, and eventually I go h4, h5, h6, h7, h8, and win the game. So after bishop to d5 here, Fabiano resigns this game, and it's another very, very big win for me. So with this win, I started to move well ahead in the 3+1 portion. I would win by a score of 5.5, 2.5. So in the 5+1, I won by 1. It was 4.5, 3.5. In the 3+1, I won by 3, 5.5, 2.5. And the final portion, I won by a score of 8.5 to 2.5. So I'm not great at math, but I believe that if my math is correct, I won by a score of 18.5 to 8.5, if I'm not mistaken. So I won by a very, very comfortable margin. Make no mistake about it. It was a big, big win for me in this quarterfinal match against Fabiano. I didn't play my absolute main openings, but it seemed to work out anyway. So we get a very, very big win against Fabiano. I move into the semifinals, where I believe I play either the talented Indian junior Nihal Sarin or Maxime Avachier-Legrand. Now, you're probably thinking this is all great and fine. You're into semifinals. That's probably all there is. But those of you guys who are watching the match live or following the SCC, you probably noticed there was some drama earlier. So I don't really want to dive into it super in depth, but I will pop up this tweet. Now, there was a tweet from Ian Nepomniachtchi, which said, for those who watch a recent C-Squared episode, it's impossible to imagine that a player is still allowed to play with headphones. Now, this is referring to the fact that I was playing the Speed Chess Championship today, wearing headphones, blasting some music. Very specifically, there were two songs. There was the Macklemores, and I think it was And Then We Dance, if I have this song correctly. There was also Lady Gaga, Poker Face, amongst many other great hits today that I was listening to. I just want to point that out for anyone who's a big fan of Macklemore or Lady Gaga. But anyway, there was this tweet from Jan, which essentially, as I read it, is saying that players should not be allowed to play with headphones. Now, there are a couple things that I do want to stress about this. The first thing that I want to stress is that players are allowed to play with headphones. Jan clearly has not read the regulations about the event. Because Alireza Firouzja, when he played Wesley So the other day, also had earbuds, so he was jamming to some music too. Now, unlike me, Alireza would go on to lose his match against Wesley in a nail biter, but nonetheless, there is a precedent, and it is not against the rules. Additionally, since people are always wondering about cheating, it's become the big topic of the day. There are a couple important things to note as well. First and foremost is that the games are not broadcast in real time. So the only way to observe these games is in chess.com/events, and the games are on a delay. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's a 15-second delay. It could be 30 seconds if I'm not mistaken. Either way, the games are on a delay. You can not watch them in live chess as they're being played. They are delayed. Secondarily, I have to point out that the chess.com, we're all in a Zoom call. We're screen sharing. We have cams in front of us, cams behind us, etc. And I think it's just very disappointing when you have top players like Ian Nepomniachtchi, who's played for the World Championship, making insinuations like this. And I know some people are going to try to refer to a different situation, but at some point there has to be a line where enough is enough. And so those are my 2 cents on the topic. But I do find it very disappointing that Ian, of all people, is out here saying these things. At any rate, you guys, I hope you have enjoyed this recap of my match against Fabiano Caruana in the Speed Chess Championship. If you have not already smashed that subscribe button below, make sure that you smash it now, and we'll be back, I think, pretty soon with some more great content. I know Magnus Carlsen is playing against Ian Nepomniachtchi tomorrow himself in the Speed Chess Championship. I will be covering that, so most likely you guys will get a big recap after Magnus dominates Nepo. We'll see if that's a jinx or not, but at any rate, that's what I expect to happen. So I'll be back with a recap after that match tomorrow. Hope you guys have enjoyed this video for YouTube, and I'll see you soon. Bye.